It was an ordinary weekend when I decided to venture into the Blackwood Forest. The kind of place everyone told you to stay away from, but a place I had never been afraid of. The stories of people who went missing there, of strange happenings and whispers, always seemed like just that, stories. I had always been skeptical, a believer in logic and reason, so I brushed off the warnings from those who insisted that the forest was haunted. After all, it was just a forest, dark, dense, and filled with trees that had stood for centuries, but nothing more. I didn't go alone, though. My friends, James and Lisa, joined me. They were both thrill seekers, eager to explore the unknown and test the boundaries of what they believed. We had heard of the stories, of course, but we never let them scare us. We thought we'd have a good time camping, hiking, telling ghost stories around the fire, and coming back with a few fun anecdotes. None of us had any idea that our trip would soon turn into a nightmare. The first signs of something wrong came when we reached the edge of the forest. There was a peculiar heaviness in the air, a stillness that I couldn't explain. It felt like the world was holding its breath, and I remember feeling a cold chill crawl down my spine. But I dismissed it as nerves, nothing more. The trees towered above us, their gnarled branches twisted into unnatural shapes, and the sun seemed to barely penetrate the thick canopy above. The further we walked, the darker it became, and the more oppressive the silence grew. It was unlike any forest I had ever been in. As we ventured deeper, the sounds of nature seemed to fade. The usual rustling of leaves, the chirping of birds, the distant calls of animals, all of it vanished, replaced by an unnerving stillness. We didn't speak much at first, but then I heard something faint, a whisper, barely audible, carried on the breeze. I stopped, straining my ears, but there was nothing. I shook it off and motioned for my friends to keep moving. "Did you hear that?" James asked, his voice shaky. I glanced over at him, noticing the unease on his face. "Probably just the wind," I replied, forcing a calmness into my voice that I didn't feel. But as I spoke, the whisper came again, louder this time, and I could swear it was calling my name. I shook my head, trying to dismiss the thought. But Lisa, who had been quiet up until that point, suddenly stopped walking. "Do you guys feel that?" she whispered, her voice trembling. Her eyes were wide, scanning the trees. "It's like we're being watched." I turned to look at her. "It's probably just your imagination." But deep down, I wasn't so sure. Something didn't feel right. We continued walking, but the tension only grew. The whispering seemed to follow us, shifting with the wind, always just out of reach. Every now and then, I'd hear a soft thud, like footsteps behind us, but whenever I turned, nothing was there. Hours passed, and we finally decided to make camp. We found a small clearing and set up our tents, though none of us really felt at ease. The forest seemed to grow darker as the evening drew on, the trees casting long, eerie shadows. We tried to keep the conversation light, talking about mundane things to distract ourselves, but it was impossible to shake the feeling that something was lurking just beyond the edge of our vision. Every so often, I would glance around, expecting to see something move in the shadows, but there was nothing. Night fell quickly, and we huddled around the fire. The crackling flames were the only sound, but even that seemed distant, as if the forest was swallowing it whole. James was the first to break the silence. "I swear, I saw something moving between the trees earlier," he said, his voice low. "It wasn't an animal. It was too fast." Lisa nodded. "I saw it too. Just a flash of something, like a shadow." I laughed it off, but the unease was starting to gnaw at me. Something was off about this place. As the fire flickered, the shadows around us seemed to grow longer, stretching toward us like reaching hands. I tried to ignore it, but the feeling of being watched was too overwhelming. The whispering returned, this time louder and clearer. It was no longer the wind. There was something intentional about it. "Do you hear that?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Lisa's face paled. "It's not the wind anymore." Suddenly, a loud crack echoed through the clearing, followed by the unmistakable sound of footsteps, heavy, deliberate, coming from just beyond the circle of light. We froze, our eyes wide with fear. I reached for the flashlight, but it was gone. It had vanished like everything else in this cursed forest. I felt a cold hand grip my heart as I stared into the dark. There was no way out now. The whispers were no longer just whispers. They were voices low, guttural, full of malice. We could hear them clearly now, but they weren't speaking words. They were screaming, silent, tortured screams. The kind of screams that echo in your mind long after you've heard them. It felt like the very air was filled with them. "Run!" James shouted, his voice breaking through the tension. We bolted from the campfire, stumbling through the underbrush, our footsteps thudding loudly against the forest floor. But the further we ran, the more disorienting the forest became. It felt like we were running in circles. No matter which direction we took, the trees closed in tighter, their twisted limbs blocking our path. And then we saw it. A figure stood at the edge of the clearing, just outside the reach of the firelight. A man, or what used to be a man. His face was a twisted mask of anguish, his eyes hollow and empty, his skin stretched tight over bones. He didn't move, just stood there, watching us with a terrifying stillness. Behind him, in the trees, other figures began to emerge, dark, shifting shapes, their movements jerky and unnatural, like marionettes controlled by unseen hands. They weren't human. We tried to scream, but no sound came out. The air was thick, stifling, like it was swallowing our voices whole. The figures moved closer, their silent screams echoing in our heads, growing louder with every step. I don't remember much after that. Everything went dark. When I woke up, I was lying on the cold forest floor, my body aching, my mind numb. The forest was silent again, but the echoes of the silent screams were still with me, buried deep in my skull. The others were gone. There was no sign of James or Lisa, just the lingering dread that had followed me from that forest. I tried to leave, but the path home was gone. The trees had closed in, and I was trapped in that nightmare. It took days, maybe weeks, to find my way out, but when I finally emerged from Blackwood Forest, I was no longer the same. The whispers still haunt me. I hear them in the quiet moments, when I'm alone, when I close my eyes. The figures, the silent screams, they never left. And I know now that Blackwood Forest doesn't let you leave, not entirely. Once you hear the silent screams, once you see the shadows moving between the trees, there's no going back. The forest claims what it wants, and it always comes back for more.